Welcome to Shaping Afghanistan. I'm Emily, and presenting this Shaping Afghanistan for you today with my colleague, Smith.
Hello. Okay, let's start. March 2015, Kabul. A young woman, Farkhunda Malikzada, just 27 years old, she was brutally killed by a mob.
And this wasn't just some isolated incident that stayed local. The sheer violence, the public nature of it, it really sparked international outrage.
Yeah, it quickly became this awful symbol, didn't it? A symbol of the persistent and really deep-rooted challenges that women face in Afghanistan.
Absolutely. And in this deep dive, we want to go beyond just the initial headlines of that horrific event.
Right.
We've looked at news reports from the time, of course, but also some really in-depth analyses from human rights groups and, crucially, perspectives from people within Afghanistan.
Just really try and understand what happened.
Exactly. What happened, how people reacted right away on the ground and, globally, and what the sort of longer-term implications of Farkhunda's death have been for the country.
So our mission today, it's pretty straightforward, but I think really vital. We want to unpack the layers of Farkhunda's story, understand the reactions it sparked inside Afghanistan and around the world, and ultimately try to grasp what this tragedy really tells us about the struggle for women's rights, the prevalence of violence, and the search for justice.
The often elusive search for justice, within the systems that exist there.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. The events of that day in March 2015.
Well, the initial reports painted a truly brutal picture. It was broad daylight near the Shado Shamshira shrine, quite a central spot in Kabul, and a woman who we later learned was Farkhunda was attacked by a mob. The accusation flying around was incredibly serious, that she had burned a copy of the Quran.
And it just sounds like things spun out of control incredibly fast.
Terrifyingly fast. Eyewitness accounts and, the social media videos that emerged pretty quickly, they described this swift, brutal assault.
A mob just descended on her.
Yeah. And despite police being present, that's a key point, there seemed to be minimal intervention as she was beaten, killed, and then her body was set on fire.
It just raises immediate questions about the rule of law, doesn't it, in such a public, violent situation?
Absolutely. And it's so important to remember who Farkhunda was beyond this horrific end.
Yes.
She was 27, a student of religious studies. Her family came out very strongly, refuting the accusation about the Quran burning.
They did. And they also mentioned she had a history of mental health issues.
That's right. And what's significant is the local mosque imam, someone who actually knew the family, described them as cultured, educated, religious people.
So there's this immediate disconnect, isn't there, between the accusation and her background? It adds this really disturbing layer.
It really does. And then it emerged that the accusation might have originated from something else entirely.
Like a verbal dispute.
Exactly. With a male amulet seller at the shrine. Reportedly, he was the source of the Quran burning accusation after they argued.
Wow. So a dispute escalates into this deadly, unfounded accusation. It's chilling. It says so much about power dynamics and how misinformation can just explode.
It absolutely does. And the reaction afterwards, well, it was immediate and intense.
Widespread public anger,
Yeah.
right, and shock, not just in Afghanistan, but internationally too.
Profound shock. The brutality, the public nature, the apparent failure of the police to stop it, it just ignited this huge wave of condemnation.
Yeah, and we saw these really significant protests erupting in Kabul. Remember those images? Women carrying Farkhunda's coffin themselves. A really powerful act, taking on a role usually reserved for men.
Such a strong statement of defiance and solidarity.
Right.
Marching through the streets demanding justice.
You heard the chants, justice, justice. It just echoed their grief and, righteous anger.
And it wasn't just Kabul. In Herat, activists held these silent protests. They had a symbolic coffin with lit candles. Another really potent image.
Yeah. Shows the depth of the anger, which is something we really wanted to explore in this deep dive, that demand for justice.
And the outrage wasn't just on the streets. It exploded online, too.
Oh, right. The hashtags.
Yeah. Social media campaigns gained huge traction. Hashtags like, I am Farkhunda, became these rallying points. People everywhere using these platforms to demand prosecution for her killers.
So after all that public outcry, let's turn to the formal justice system. How did it actually respond?
Well, the legal process did get underway. About 13 arrests were reported pretty much on the day of her burial.
Okay.
And eventually that number rose to 49 people detained.
And that included both civilians from the mob and police.
Yes, civilians and, significantly, members of the security forces who were actually at the scene.
Right. So what happened at the initial trial?
The initial trial handed down some seemingly strong verdicts. 4 individuals got death sentences.
Okay.
Several others got prison terms, ranging from 8 to 16 years. There was one minor involved. He got 10 years.
And the police officers.
11 police officers received 1-year sentences for essentially failing to protect her, dereliction of duty. 8 other officers were acquitted.
But those sentences, especially for the police,
Yeah.
they didn't really satisfy the calls for justice, did they?
No, not for many. There was a strong feeling among the public and activists that 1 year for officers who basically stood by. It felt woefully inadequate.
Especially with the video evidence showing their inaction. Do the sources give any sense of why the courts might have seen that as sufficient, while the public clearly didn't?
That's a really good question. It's possible the legal system was focused very narrowly on, individual responsibility under existing laws for negligence or dereliction. Like, what could they prove in court against each officer?
Whereas the public anger was broader.
Exactly. It tapped into systemic failures, maybe a culture of impunity, things that are much harder to address through individual criminal charges alone. So you get this disconnect between the legal framework and what society felt was just.
And then the legal process took another turn, which caused even more controversy, the appeals court.
Right. The appeal court decided to quash those initial death sentences. They reduced them to prison terms. 3 got 20 years, 1 got 10 years, as a minor had their sentence upheld, I believe. And the shrine caretaker, who'd been implicated, was actually acquitted.
And the way this appeal happened, it was done in secret.
Reportedly, yes, behind closed doors. That lack of transparency, as you can imagine, just fueled the anger and disappointment of Farkhunda's family and the rights activists.
I remember her brother called it a show.
He did. He strongly criticized the lack of openness. It just fed into this perception that the system wasn't delivering real justice.
And the lawyers for Farkhunda's family, they weren't happy either.
Not at all. They publicly stated the appeal decisions were deeply unfair. They even alleged they were often shut out of Supreme Court sessions during the investigation.
Which raises serious questions about due process, doesn't it?
Absolutely. About the fairness of the whole legal proceeding in her case.
So if we step back and connect this to the bigger picture, Farkhunda's case, as uniquely horrific as it sadly wasn't isolated, was it?
Yeah.
It reflects this broader pattern of violence against women in Afghanistan.
Unfortunately, yes. UN Women reports, for instance, paint a really stark picture. A very high percentage of women there experience violence in their lifetime. Forced marriage rates are alarmingly high, too.
And how are these cases usually dealt with? Is it always through the formal courts?
Often not, because the formal judicial system is often seen as, deficient. There are issues of corruption, long delays, plus strong cultural pressures.
Do people turn elsewhere?
They often turn to traditional jirgas. These are local councils operating largely outside the formal system.
Okay.
A UN report actually highlighted this, finding something like 65% of the cases they studied were resolved through mediation in these traditional settings. Only about 5% actually went to the formal criminal courts.
But using jirgas for cases of violence against women, that raises questions, surely.
Huge questions. While they might seem quicker, are they really delivering justice? The UN report itself raised serious concerns.
About women's voices not being heard.
Exactly. Women often lack agency in these processes. They might be denied participation, pressured into mediation, or just have decisions imposed on them by male elders. It can end up reinforcing inequalities rather than tackling the violence.
So given these issues with the domestic system, what happened next regarding Farkhunda's case?
Well, recognizing these shortcomings, the Afghan Women's Network took a significant step. They started seeking justice for Farkhunda at an international level.
Trying to find accountability elsewhere.
Precisely. It underscored the feeling that the national legal system just wasn't providing a satisfactory resolution.
You know, some people hoped Farkhunda's murder could have been a real turning point for women's rights in Afghanistan, a catalyst for deep change.
There's definitely that hope, that potential. But it seems, looking back, that the initial shock and outrage, maybe it faded or got overshadowed. Perhaps there wasn't enough sustained, deep analysis to really address the underlying entrenched issues.
And the event certainly highlighted the role of religious extremism and these deeply ingrained societal norms that devalue women.
Undeniably, that contributes to this kind of horrific violence. I remember seeing one comment describing Farkhunda as a victim of violent ideology and her attackers as being like hyenas.
That's chilling. A powerful, disturbing image of that brutality.
It really is. And in Kabul, they did erect a memorial in her honor.
Yeah.
a symbol of remembrance, of resistance against fundamentalism. But as one Kabul resident was quoted saying, "The memorial is important, but it's not enough. The need for actual justice remains paramount."
So what about the Afghan government's response at the time? Did they react to the public outcry?
They did, at least initially. The Ministry of Women's Affairs strongly condemned the murder. They publicly called on President Ghani, who was in power then, to act on his promises regarding women's rights.
Okay.
They even announced plans to set up a special body to investigate violence against women cases.
And the First Lady's office?
They also issued statements indicating coordination with the Ministry of Women's Affairs to address these kinds of cases. And about a year after her death, a presidential decree was issued.
What did that do?
It ordered a review of Farkhunda's case and the sentences that had been handed down.
And internationally, what was the UN saying?
The UN also weighed in strongly. They called on the Afghan government to protect women's rights, both within those mediation processes we talked about, making sure they were safe for women, and also through long-term reform of the judicial system itself. The UN Special Representative also stressed how vital it was for women to be meaningfully involved in any peace processes to make sure their rights were safeguarded in whatever came next politically.
But despite all these statements and initial actions, there was still criticism, wasn't there?
Yeah.
About whether the government was actually doing enough.
Yes, particularly from groups like Human Rights Watch. They pointed out that while, some progress had been made on women's rights over the previous couple of decades,
Right.
the government's actual actions to consistently protect those rights, especially in the face of these persistent challenges, often fell short. They felt it was insufficient.
And looking at the longer term, it's quite sobering, isn't it? By 2022, the 8th anniversary of her murder, there were apparently no public ceremonies held in Afghanistan to mark it.
Yeah, that absence is telling. It could suggest a worrying decline in sustained national focus on the issue over time. Public attention moved on, perhaps.
It does raise that concerning point,
Yeah.
that despite the initial global shock and outrage, Farkhunda's death might not have ultimately led to the kind of fundamental, lasting change needed.
Change in women's status, change in addressing violence, strengthening the rule of law. It seems those deep shifts didn't fully materialize in a sustainable way.
And then, tragically, came the Taliban's return to power. What happened to the case then?
Well, reports indicate that after the Taliban took over, all those who had been imprisoned in connection with Farkhunda's murder were released.
Release.
That's what's reported. And as far as we know from the sources, there are no current reports suggesting the case is being pursued or reinvestigated by the current authorities.
So wrapping this up, this deep dive into Farkhunda Malikzada's death in March 2015, it's just heartbreaking. It really exposed the brutal reality of mob violence.
And those deep-seated issues. Violence against women, yes, but also the significant shortcomings in Afghanistan's justice system.
And while her murder definitely sparked that initial massive outrage and brought attention, maybe temporary attention, to women's rights, the long-term impact, the delivery of real justice, it all remains deeply concerning.
Yeah, our look at these sources reveals this really complex, troubling mix of restrictive social norms, a fragile rule of law, and just the immense ongoing challenges women face trying to get justice in the country.
Which leaves us with a final thought, really, for you, the listener, to consider.
In light of everything surrounding Farkhunda's death, the horror, the initial reaction, the legal twists, the eventual lack of sustained justice, what does this tell us about the sheer difficulty of achieving meaningful, lasting change in societies that are grappling with such deep gender inequality and a weak rule of law?
And perhaps, what are the responsibilities here, both for local communities and, the wider international community, in ensuring accountability for these kinds of acts and in protecting vulnerable people from such brutality in the future?